Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and Professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers, and I'm delighted to welcome you back to the second session in the fall mini course, The End of the World. Tonight's topic is resurrection. Last week we did, our scholar did divine judgment. And our scholar is Professor Jenny LeBenz, and she is currently an associate professor at St. Francis College. Hold on one second, my screens are not moving, 1 minute. So Jenny LeBenz is associate professor of religious studies at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, and she specializes in ancient Jewish literature and religion from a comparative perspective. Her first book, Socratic Torah, Non-Jews in Rabbinic Intellectual Culture, was published by Oxford University Press in 2013, and it examined the attitudes and discourse about non-Jews in late antique rabbinic literature. And her second book, which she completed here at Rutgers as the Alan and Joan Bildner Visiting Scholar this fall, is entitled Beyond Hope. And I hope, Jenny, you'll talk about what that title means at some point, Beyond Hope, because it's kind of paradoxical. Beyond Hope, Rabbinic Eschatology of Late Antiquity in Comparative Perspective. And that too is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Now, some of you were here last week, and I'm delighted to welcome you back, and I hope we have some new people too. But I just want to go over the ground rules. You are all muted. And if you have a question, and last week we had wonderful questions, so please don't be shy to ask any questions you have, both it could be about terminology or about more conceptual things that are being offered. Please put them in the chat. And Dr. LeBenz will stop probably between 20 and 25 minutes going forward to address those questions, and then also at the end. So please, even though we can't see you, and you're sort of out there in the cyber world, please don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat, and then I will pose them to Dr. LeBenz. Closed captions are available. It doesn't do such a great job with foreign languages, but on your screen, you can click on captions or on the 3 dots to enable captions so you can see a sort of running transcript. And the mini course is being recorded and will be up on the Bildner Center website. So again, I'm so delighted to welcome Professor LeBenz back, the Alan Joan Bildner Visiting Scholar for Fall 2024, and to talk about the second part of her mini course, Resurrection. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Did I just?
Okay. You're there.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can I go ahead and share my screen?
Okay.
Okay, now, just a test. Do you see my notes or do you see one big cover page?
I personally see one big cover page, and it's slide 1 of 27.
Okay.
But
okay, great.
We can see your notes also, though, Jenny.
Oh, all right. So let me just do this differently.
Okay.
1 second. That's interesting because I shared the wrong. Oh, I'm sorry. Last week it worked just fine. Okay. There, that. So now you should see just the one screen.
Yes, that's right.
And is that still the case?
Nope. The first one was better. Now we see all the toolbar.
Oh no.
That's it. That's good.
Well, it is, but not for me. I'm so sorry. Okay, I think. I'm really sorry. I have to figure out a way to very quickly take care of this issue.
That screen looks good.
Oh, got it. Okay. All right. And I can see what I'm sharing too. All right. Well, good evening, everyone.
The joke is that it's not the end of the world that it didn't work out for 2 seconds.
Good one. Good one. Points for everyone who was quietly saying that on your in your muted rooms. All right. Can I advance my own slides? There we go. Okay. All right. So our topic tonight is resurrection in rabbinic literature in the context, again, of the end of the world. So I'll start with a quicker version of the same framing that I did last time, just to make sure that anyone who wasn't here last time has a sense of when and what we're talking about, and also just give a quick refresher for those who were. This course is looking at rabbinic literature of late antiquity. So on the timeline, this is roughly the 2nd through 6th centuries of the Common Era. It's after the Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. It's after the Bible is already complete. This is post-biblical Judaism. And it's this time period when this group of intellectuals and jurists and leaders who are known as the rabbis, that the is doing a lot of work there, the rabbis, developed their distinctive style of teaching and creating literature and really conceiving the form of Judaism that we know as Rabbinic Judaism, which is the main form of Judaism from then on and down to today. And the body of literature they produce in those centuries containing all of that work is known as rabbinic literature or Talmudic literature. And this is the basis of Rabbinic Judaism. And also significant is that in this same time frame, early Christianity was growing up right alongside Rabbinic Judaism, based on the same Second Temple and biblical heritage. So very exciting time period. Now, in terms of the topic of the end of the world, I explained last time that when I use that term, the end of the world, as the familiar catch-all for a lot of related terms that people throw around, right? So the world to come, or the Messiah, or the end of days, salvation, redemption, new creation. There's all these terms that are this cluster. And I introduced the academic term eschatology as the very broad and not all that helpful word that academics use to describe that cluster of ideas. And finally, I explained that when I look at the eschatological literature, the literature about all that stuff on the left side of the screen, of the rabbis of late antiquity and really also of early Christianity, what my research has found them to be describing is the best of all possible worlds. So we can look at topics and how they relate to how they function in the best of all possible worlds. One of the things I said is that saying it that way changes the nature of the questions that we ask. So in the best of all possible worlds, what does divine judgment look like? That was the sort of framing question. And what we saw, what I hope we saw, what I tried to show, is that in rabbinic literature, we find that divine judgment has a lot of argumentation and collaboration and learning, and very little to no perfect divine truth with total divine power and autocratic decisions. It turns out, like I said at the end, that the rabbis imagined divine judgment in the world to come, so to speak, as quite similar to rabbinic judgment and rabbinic activity in this world. And that means that that aspect of the world to come is already accessible here and now in the rabbinic life. And I called that, I referred a few times to the life of Torah, or the Torah as the embodiment of that. And there was a very important question that came up afterwards that I looked through the saved chat of questions, a very important question came up that was worded so well, and I wanted to just put it up here and answer it as clearly as I could. The question was, well, how can the Torah be considered a model for the best, like the best of all possible worlds? There are plenty of bad actions and betrayals and killing, etc. Of course, there's also a lot of good examples, but who gets to choose what constitutes the good? So, especially given that we are in the Torah reading cycle, the weekly Torah reading cycle in the book of Genesis, 100%. This is a well taken point. When the rabbis talk about Torah, and when today contemporary, both lay people and scholars talk about the rabbinic perspective on Torah, sometimes without that definite article, without the, it refers not to the narrative world of Genesis or even of the whole Torah. It doesn't refer to the lives of the characters in the Torah. The Torah is taken to be is the word that symbolizes all of Jewish rabbinic style, Jewish study, Jewish observance of mitzvot, Jewish practice. That's all encapsulated in Torah. So that's why when they say Torah study, we'll actually see, well, I have an example. We will only see part of it tonight. Sometimes they'll say, it says in the Torah, and they don't mean the Torah as in the 5 books of Moses. They mean a later book of the Hebrew Bible. But the whole thing, that sacred corpus, is what they're referring to. So the life of Torah is, for the rabbis, Judaism, basically. So I hope that that's clear. It's certainly not about the lives of individual characters in the Torah. And we're going to come back to that usage today and next time. So again, there are lots of questions about what the best of all possible worlds will be like. These are the questions of eschatology. And we started by looking at the question of divine judgment, which is one that looms very large in both Jewish and Christian eschatology. Since it's a pretty big deal. And we can sort of put that aside for a little bit. And tonight we'll talk about this other really important concept that looms very large in the lives of ancient Jews and Christians, which is the resurrection of the dead. What role does resurrection play in the best of all possible worlds? What does resurrection mean in that context? So as last time, we should start really with what are our presuppositions? What are we coming in with? So I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions. You can put thoughts in the chat if you like, but the question is when you think of resurrection, what do you think of? I think most people think about what scholars call the meeting again motif, which is that we will be reunited with our loved ones who've passed away. It's this beautiful concept of everyone being together again. Probably some people immediately think of an event called the resurrection, when we'll all be brought back to life together. And that big event, as well as the reunion with lost loved ones, are things that people of lots of different religions have thought about and written about and produced moving artwork about since long before the time of the ancient rabbis and obviously long since. Again, scholars call this the meeting again motif. There's even a German term for this specific aspect of resurrection, for those who enjoy such terms as I do. And it's what many people assume is the role of resurrection in the best of all possible worlds, in a sort of intuitive way, or in the world to come. It allows us to rejoice together again with our dearly departed. Now, before I tell you if that is part of what the rabbis of Talmudic literature meant when they discussed resurrection, I need to say an important thing up front. This session is not meant to tell you that that's not true. Or that Jews don't believe in this. I think this idea is a really important emotional and psychological thing that many of us hold on to, and I would never want to diminish that. But what we're going to do in this hour is to explore other ways in which very different concepts of resurrection played a role for the rabbis, and other possibilities of how to think about what this huge concept can mean. So, I'll tell you that you might be surprised to learn, as I was, that nowhere in classical rabbinic literature, again, that's not the entirety of Jewish tradition, but it's the foundation of all of rabbinic Judaism. Nowhere in classical rabbinic literature does the meeting again motif appear. The rabbis describe contact with the dead in various forms, but when they discuss resurrection, they never talk about it in terms of that soothing and hopeful sense of reunification with lost loved ones. That doesn't mean they never thought about it, but it definitely means it wasn't the most important aspect of resurrection for them. But they do mention resurrection all the time. So we need to wonder, what did they think was important about resurrection? And again, the way we can frame that question is, what is the role of resurrection in the best of all possible worlds? We doing okay? I can't really hear if you're responding, but I'm going to go ahead and imagine everybody giving a thumbs up. Okay. So for me, I like to start with the words we're using. Last time, again, we talked about the end of the world. Oh, I see thumbs ups. That was cool. A thumbs up floated above my screen. Okay. Thank you to the thumber upper. All right. So for me, like I said, I like to talk about the words we're using, the terms. So last time we talked about the end of the world as a phrase that's sort of common these days. And again, I introduced the term eschatology as the academic term for all the various things that people include in the end of the world, or messianism, or salvation. And I explained that my study of rabbinic literature and of early Christianity led me to characterize eschatology most clearly as ideas about the best of all possible worlds. And this helps account for the wide range of meanings people ascribe to things like the world to come, or indeed resurrection. So let's see what work we need to do with the term resurrection to get to some kind of understanding of what the rabbis might have been thinking about when they said or heard that word. So the Hebrew term for resurrection, which we meet all the time in the Siddur, in the prayer book, and which is used throughout rabbinic literature, is Tichiyat HaMetim. But, whoops, I pressed the wrong direction. There we go. Okay. But like the Greek term eschatos, which is the basis of the word eschatology, Tichiyat HaMetim has a really broad range of possible meanings. So to demonstrate that, so Tichiyat HaMetim is two Hebrew words. Tichiyat comes from the verb chaya, which means to live. And in the form of Tichiyat, it means most straightforwardly to cause to live. But the rabbis also use this same form to mean to sustain in life or to bring to life. So that's a bit broad. And then, so hametim, this is a noun that means the dead. It's a plural noun, the dead people. So most straightforwardly, it means those who are dead. But the rabbis also use it to mean those destined for death and those who are as if dead. So I don't think the word resurrection captures this flexibility on both ends, both sides of the word. Here I don't have a particularly better term, but at least a better English rendering of the rabbi's term here might be enlivening of the dead. But even if we use the word resurrection, which I will on and off for the next 40 minutes or so, this idea of resurrection, which was truly very widespread in ancient Jewish and Christian contexts, was never a clear-cut concept. It seems so straightforward, right? You die, you undie. It was never so clear-cut. And this is the interesting thing about both religions, Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Neither of them started from scratch. They had this whole heritage of biblical and Second Temple period literature and practices and assumptions and terms even. And they also had a very interesting and diverse world in which they lived alongside people of other traditions. So it's not uncommon in rabbinic literature that they use terms without explaining them. And sometimes we have to assume that they all just took it for granted, that it meant a particular thing, even if we don't know what that is. Sometimes we have to assume, though, and actually in certain cases it can be demonstrated, that they had no idea what these terms actually meant, and even why they were part of rabbinic culture, but there they were, they had inherited them. So rabbinic discussions of resurrection definitely take for granted that whatever the Hebrew term tchiyat hametim, let's say enlivening of the dead, whatever it means to them, it's an important aspect of their eschatology. But they don't explain it clearly and fully, much less consistently. And in this, the rabbis are no different from their Christian and other Jewish counterparts. So as inheritors of this tradition, we can take it to mean whatever we want. But if we want to know what the rabbis had in mind, and at least I do, then we have to look not just at the words they use, but how and when they use them. So let's break down some options. Probably the most common and easiest way to think about resurrection is just life and then death and then resurrection in a linear, consecutive way. But life, death, and resurrection could also be thought of as a sort of triad that doesn't really fit together on a line in that way, where there's some overlap in certain ways. And maybe even it would be more accurate to say that they're not a triad at all, where life and death have a lot in common and obviously exist on a timeline. Resurrection, or better, tchiyat hametim, refers to this whole other plane of existence with like a different set of rules. Tchiyat hametim is about transcending earthly life and death. It's about, in many ways, participation in eternity and eternal life. I think, to go back to what I said about the idea of the meeting again motif being important and not wanting to say it's not true, or dismiss it. I think that grief and comfort exists in that life and death world, where we usually think of resurrection as something that can offer comfort and hope in the face of grief and also of our own mortality. But there's this other role that resurrection plays in the literature that doesn't do anything to soothe personal grief, but may do a lot to help intellectually or spiritually relate humanity's mortality to God's immortality. So before I show you the texts and how they do that, I want to zoom out a little to give this idea just a drop more context. So by convention, Jews and scholars of Judaism assume that since the Jewish Messiah has not yet come, we live in an entirely unredeemed world. And all of our eschatological hopes, our dreams for the best of all possible worlds, are going to come to fruition far in the future when the Messiah comes or some other great apocalypse happens. I showed you this image of that last time. But when we looked at how the rabbis actually describe divine judgment, so to speak, in the end times, it looked a lot like rabbinic judgment and Torah study in this world, which means, like I said, this aspect of the end time expectation is also available now, right now. It's different from what happens at the actual end. There's no immediate heaven or hell or punishment by means of rabbinic judgment and Torah study in this world, but the best of all possible forms of judgment is nevertheless already accessible. So when it comes to resurrection, you might think, well, fine, but resurrection is a whole miraculous thing that can't possibly be already accessible in the present, because death is permanent in this world. We're all mortal. But again, when we look at how the rabbis talked about resurrection, tchiyat hametim, and what they mean by it, it most certainly is something that's accessible in the present. And in this, the rabbis were in good company. Early Christians talked about resurrection in many of the same ways. So I'm not going to pause yet for questions. I want to show you some texts, since this is all really theoretical so far. The texts establish several overlapping things. First, I pressed the button, but nothing happened. There we go. First, that engaging in a life of Torah for the rabbis is about participating in eternity, even being immortal. So life takes on a different meaning, like the term, the idea of life, right? Because there is immortality through Torah, through engagement with Judaism. The second thing is, I don't love the way I put this here, overcoming death, but I didn't come up with something better. The rabbis sometimes talk about death in a way that isn't at all about physical death and burial. So death, the term death, takes on a very different meaning too. And there are ways in which the rabbis talk about Tchiyat HaMetim that are simply not about collective resurrection of the dead. And I think that's because of the first two of those. So in many ways, we end up with a concept of life continuous, despite life and death, that isn't about revivification, bringing back to life, but about a different way in which to imagine the human relationship to eternity. So we'll start with three very brief texts that exemplify each of these things, and then we can dig a little deeper through some more texts. So for immortality through Torah, went too fast. There we go. The rabbis say that anyone who has a child who labors in Torah, that means who engages in Judaism, in Jewish study, in Jewish practice, it's as if he did not die. In other words, if my father who has passed away, well, if I am his child and I engage in Torah, my father didn't die. Okay, we'll come back to this. It's a pretty brazen thing for them to say, right? Maybe the as if, though, is doing a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting. We'll see that they say a lot without the as if too. So what about overcoming death? There are those who say, and this is not there are those who say like some crazies. We don't have specific names of rabbis who say it, but there are rabbis who say Moses didn't die. Moses never died. Moses from the Torah never died. Instead, he continues to serve above. Right? Again, pretty brazen, because in the text of the Torah, he dies. He's buried. There are other characters in the Hebrew Bible who it doesn't say that they died and were buried. Enoch in Genesis, Elijah the prophet just sort of goes up. That is not the case with Moses. So it's a very intense thing that they're saying, that he continues to serve above, and that means he didn't die. It's a very different usage of the word die from what we were used to. And finally, and this is a more famous one that perhaps a variation of it you've heard. The Palestinian Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi says, every day upon waking up from sleep, a person should recite, "Blessed are you, Lord, who gives life to the dead." There's this, it comes in through the liturgy, in the prayer book in a couple of different ways, that when we go to sleep, God is holding on to our soul and we're sort of dead. We're dead enough that waking up in the morning, at least according to the rabbi who gave this directive, we can say, this is Baruch Mechayei HaMetim. We can say that this is an example of Tichiyat HaMetim, an example of what we normally call resurrection, but it's just waking up in the morning. So I want to go through a couple more texts that will dig deeper into this, but I want to ask Nancy, I want to pause if anyone had clarification questions or smaller questions that we can pause and consider now.
There is a question that I think is a little bit of, I think you stated it, but I think people would still like clarification. I have a gazillion questions actually, but okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is resurrection supposed to occur only at the end of the world? I think you're arguing for a continuum. Do you want to say something else about that?
Yeah, so the way that the way that we normally use the word resurrection, the way that it's conventionally thought about is that this is something that happens at the end of the world, right? But what I'm describing is that the rabbis also talk about resurrection in this world, even as in this last text here at the bottom of the screen, as a daily occurrence, using the same term. They also do have traditions about that refer to a big event called the resurrection that will happen at the end. So that's not something that they've never considered, but they make much more use of the term Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, as a sort of other plane of existence continuum that we can actually access, spoiler alert, through a life of Torah.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, I don't know why I'm blurry now, everyone, sorry, I'm in some liminal state between this world and the next. I don't know why the camera's doing that, but I think one of the challenges, Professor Lebens, is the word, is when you say resurrection in English, most of us imagine, and you haven't mentioned this, the early Christian or the early Jesus-loving Jewish understanding of resurrection, which comes after a physical death. And you're arguing that the word Techiyat HaMetim actually has subtleties and nuances that doesn't necessarily mean it's projected only to this thing called the eschaton. So I think
Yes,
one of
but
the challenges for all of us always is that we read or we understand these traditions through a very particular process of translation, both from the Greek to the Latin and then to the English. And we, unless you go back, you know, you in what you said is when you go back to these sources in Hebrew and Aramaic, you see a wide variety of meanings that many of us, if we're not expert in these texts, don't have access to. So I think it's one of the challenges. There are a bunch of other questions. I'm going to throw them at you.
Let me just say one thing.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Christianity, especially the earliest Christians, earliest followers of Jesus, they do have the story of Jesus physically dying and coming back to life. But first of all, there was a whole tradition in the early days. It was fairly quickly considered sort of heretical within Christian circles that, oh, he never really died. But more important, I was going to say, the idea of resurrection being accessible in this life is already present in the Gospels. It's as present in early Christian literature, the idea of Tchiyat HaMetim or resurrection as something accessible in this world, irrespective of physical life and death. It's as present in early Christianity as in rabbinic literature.
Okay, so a couple other questions, then I'm going to sort of I'm going to punch a question to the end that you can save to the end. But the questions are, and you'll take what you want. Someone said Moses dies. Isn't that just like saying Shakespeare didn't die, or maybe another major figure didn't die because they live on through their writings? Someone also wanted to know the Siddur or the Baruch, HaMechia Metim, how does it relate to the saying of the Shema upon rising? So those are two. And then, oh my goodness, this is a very long question. Doesn't it state in the Torah that there's a promise that those who keep it will have a long and prosperous life? Is that this conception of Techiyat HaMetim? And then they say, isn't it counterproductive to be concerned about the afterlife? And the last thing I would say, and you don't have to address this now, you might want to address it next week, is from a psychological point of view, one might argue that all of this is just a way of warding off what we know is the inevitable, which is we are going to die. We're so going to die. Anyway,
Yeah, I mean,
go for it. Go for any of those questions, whatever you want to address there.
For the latter, I mean, there's a great deal to support the idea that all of religion is because death, and that's bad. So religion is there to deal with that. Of course, anytime you're talking about something that transcends death, there's an aspect of it that relates to just the horrible reality of death. Probably more so for individuals facing their own mortality than, like, none of this is very comforting. You know, Moses's, kids, the fact that he lives on above doesn't help them if they want to talk to dad. you know? I do think and so that doesn't make it less true. I think the question of whether it's true or not, or whether it's counterproductive or not, is not quite the right, well, it's a little presumptuous of me. For me, it's not the right question, because then there's a yes or no answer, and we either embrace a whole lot of weird stuff or we chuck a whole lot of really valuable stuff out. I prefer to think about, what do we gain by thinking about this material? In fact, that was the research question that started this whole project of mine almost a dozen years ago. I find the rabbis to be intellectual and cosmopolitan and interesting, not always, right about things. They got sort of everything about women wrong, but they got things wrong. But overall, it's really interesting people. And I found everything about the end of the world and eschatology to be really not that, and irrational and uninteresting. And so my inquiry was, why were they talking about this? Why did they frame this? Why did they frame anything in terms of the next world? And what I found is really that it's a way of describing, like I said, the best of all possible worlds, which is both aspirational and as valuable as talking about what God is. These are horizons to approach and to conceptualize, and we'll talk more about this aspect next time, but to touch in some small measure in our finite lives. I do think.
Question, sorry, I'm gonna ask you one other
Yeah.
question that I think is very apposite here. Someone noticed that in the Sifrei Devarim, Sifrei Deuteronomy
Yeah.
text, it starts off with a kind of a locution, I guess. There's probably another name for it. There are those who say, quote, Moses didn't die, instead he continues to serve above. And the participant is asking, isn't that a minority view? So I guess the larger question is how do you, as a scholar, distinguish between, quote unquote, more conventional and majoritarian views among the rabbis versus, quote unquote, minority views? Or is that not an issue for you in your scholarship?
It's an interesting question. So the answer is basically, it's not clear whether there are those who say it's not clear if it's minority or how things get categorized. The rabbis themselves do tell us, they tell us explicitly, and they tell us by including in their literature all the minority views. They indicate to us that the minority views matter. In terms of the broader issue as a scholar, when I see a trend in rabbinic literature, how do I know whether it's just kind of like a sub thread, like there's these, some group of rabbis that are unconventional, or if it's majoritarian? There's no way to know, because if they say something a lot, like on every page, you might say, well, that's obvious majority. Or whoever's editing this really wants it to be the majority, and it's not, so they have to drive it home. If something comes up just once, you could say, well, it's just a minority opinion. Or you could say, well, they all took it for granted, so it's only ever articulated the one time. So what do? We should, use all the tools we can to figure out, in literary analysis and such, if there's a way to say what's a majoritarian view. But I think also the idea that scholars can dissociate and objectively determine what the majority thought. Very few people think that that's possible anymore. And in fact, there's a practice among scholars of critical subjectivity, which means being aware of who I am and what I want the text to say, being open about that. And then someone who comes from a different point of view can say, well, I heard that differently based on who I am, right? So I'm going to find the places where the rabbis say things that, not that I, we try to correct for this. I don't sort of come into the come onto the page with, all the preset conclusions. None of my conclusions in this book I didn't have any of them when I started. But where my imagination takes me is because of who I am. So, if this sort of thing, either doesn't move you, or you feel like, you're hearing these texts in a different way, run with that, see where it goes, and that is the prerogative of all human beings who get to read any text. And within the community of scholars, that's what we do. For a very long time in the study of classical rabbinics, cisgender, straight, white men of privilege were the only ones imagining what the rabbinic community was like. In the past 20 years or so, that has radically changed. And there has been absolute flowering of all different perspectives on what they might have meant when they said X, Y, and Z, and what might have been an idea they would consider, and they would that might even have been the majority view, that those guys who were thinking about it in the past never considered. In my I'll just say one thing and then I'll go back to the text, because there's some neat ones. In my first book it's called Socratic Torah. So it was about rabbinic attitudes towards non-Jews. And I opened the book by saying that, we often think about what the rabbis of antiquity, the Talmudic rabbis, their ideal world would probably have looked something like a yeshiva in Borough Park. And then I spend, 250 pages explaining that that doesn't appear to have been the case. So I think the only reason people thought that it was the case was because of who was doing the imagining. Okay. I'm looking at the time. I want to walk you through a few texts that will concretize some of these things that I just showed snippets of. So immortality through Torah. We'll start with this idea of immortality through Torah. And it has to do with through engagement with Torah, Judaism. And it has to do with the idea that when God gave the Torah to Israel, the plan was that all along, the plan all along was that with it would come the gift of immortality. And this is based on a very important verse from Psalms that was also important to Christians. I said, this is God saying, I said, you are gods, you human beings are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Achen, which I translated here indeed, but it's a tricky word because it can mean indeed, or it can mean nevertheless, or but. So it can either be a conjunction or a disjunction in relationship to what came first. So you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Indeed, as humans you shall die, and as one of the princes you shall fall. So the rabbinic tradition on this goes like this. And there's multiple. You stood before me at Sinai and you said, this is God speaking to the people of Israel, and it's playing on this I said, right? You stood before me at Sinai and you said, all that the Lord has said, we will do and we will obey, right? You accepted the Torah, people of Israel. I too then said, you are gods, right? When that happened, when God gives the Torah to Israel, God says, boom, you're gods. You have divinity, you have eternity, something. But when you said to the calf, this is your God, Israel, that's the sin of the golden calf. So too I said to you, indeed, as humans you shall die. The Torah is so often thought of today as something that was about God giving a gift to human beings so that human beings could deal with life in this world. But the way the rabbis talk about it, it's much more the case that the gift of Torah was the portal to immortality and to the best of all possible worlds. But we messed up, so now, at least on face value, we're not physically immortal. We die. And yet, the Torah makes us like gods. Now, you might say, well, okay, that's just about the scene then at Sinai, but it got messed up. It didn't happen. So let's look at another version of this tradition based on this same verse from Psalms. Rabbi Simai said, there's going to be two traditions of Rabbi Simai. And he was a big deal. Actually, just today I was looking up all the usages of him. He was a big deal. All the creatures who were created from heaven, their bodies and souls are from heaven. Likewise, all the creatures who were created from the earth, their bodies and souls are from the earth, except for human beings, whose soul is from heaven and whose body is from the earth. Okay, so we're sort of hybrid and we're unique among all of God's creatures. Therefore, if a person performs the Torah and the will of one's parent in heaven, the will of God, behold, they are like the creatures above. Relying on this verse from Psalms, I said, you are God's children of the Most High, all of you. If one doesn't perform Torah or the will of one's parent in heaven, nevertheless, as humans, you shall die. Which is to say, if you follow the Torah, you don't die. If you don't follow the Torah, you do die. Now, doing the mitzvot, living the life of Torah, literally gives you immortality. But he's not insane, right? He knows we all die. He's talking about this other sort of immortality. And he now explicitly connects this with the phrase Tchiyat HaMetim. And thus Rabbi Simai taught, there is no section of the Torah that doesn't include Tchiyat HaMetim, but the problem is we do not know how to interpret it. So he's saying the entire Torah, all of the mitzvot, all of Jewish practice is suffused with this theme, and it's clearly not restricted to a specific collective experience, either that happened in the past or to happen at some discrete time in the future. It's a way of existing and conceiving of life in a way that transcends death and mortality. And indeed, throughout rabbinic literature, the Torah is referred to as an elixir of life. And engaging in Torah study or Torah observance is referred to countless times as the life of eternity, Chayei Olam. And it's contrasted with Chayei Sha'ah, the momentary life, temporal life. That's a really common turn of phrase that is used throughout rabbinic literature. The Torah is Chayei Olam, is eternal life. I want to show you a way in which the rabbis sometimes talk about Tchiyat HaMetim in terms of revivification, reviving those who are literally dead, but not in the sense of a promise for the future for all of us or our loved ones. Instead, this text situates resurrection as something that happened in the past, again, closely connected with Torah. Okay, so this is from the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, with each and every word, we're at the scene of the giving of the Torah, with each and every word that emanated from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he, the soul of Israel departed. As it is said, my soul departs with his speech. The soul of Israel departed means Israel died. The whole group dropped dead. God says, Anochi, at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, everybody dies. And the next question is a fabulous question. And it's why I love the Talmud. And since with the first word, their soul departed, how did they receive the second word? Very good question. The answer is fantastic. He brought down the dew with which the Holy One, blessed be he, will in the future resurrect the dead, and resurrected them. Up, down, up, down, up, down, right? Every time God speaks, they die. God sprinkles the dew that is referred to as the means of resurrection, and they arise. So of course you can see that the text does not point to a future event. It does point to a future event also, because he brought down the dew with which the Holy One will in the future resurrect the dead. So there is this idea that there is something that's going to happen at the end, just like there's an idea that there is a divine judgment that happens at the end that results in heaven or hell, right? And resurrected them. But it happened in the past. It's happened already, and with the result, not that everyone rejoins their loved ones, but this sort of incredible experience of hearing God's word that necessitates and that leads to God granting this renewed life. And the rabbis are not the only ones to talk about resurrection this way. The Christians, like I said, writing at this time, talked in very similar ways. And in modern literature, we find a continuation of that. A beautiful example of that is from Frederick Douglass, the great 19th century abolitionist and writer and former slave. He wrote in My Bondage and My Freedom, "Covey was a tyrant and a cowardly one withal. After resisting him, I felt as I had never felt before. It was a resurrection from the dark and pestiferous tomb of slavery to the heaven of comparative freedom. I was no longer a servile coward, trembling under the frown of a brother worm of the dust, but my long cowed spirit was roused to an attitude of manly independence. I had reached the point at which I was not afraid to die. This spirit made me a free man in fact, while I remained a slave in form." So you might think that being born again or resurrected in this lifetime sounds a bit more Christian than Jewish, but honestly, it's something that Jewish and Christian literature share from late antiquity already. I want to leave time for some more questions. I just want to show you about Moses didn't die. That's a short example, but the most famous example of a tradition like that is about Jacob from the book of Genesis. And I have to move something on my screen so I can see it. Rabbi Yitzchak said to Rav Nachman, Rav Nachman had said, "Tell me something that Rabbi Yochanan, your teacher, had said when he was alive." So this is the Rabbi Yitzchak's choice of tradition to share from Rabbi Yochanan. "Thus said Rabbi Yochanan, our ancestor Jacob did not die." And the response here is terrific. He says, "What, for nothing they eulogized and embalmed and buried him?" He's saying that literally makes no sense in the actual sense of the word literally, not the way the kids use it today. So he said to him, "Now, I'm interpreting this text, this verse from Jeremiah, where it says, 'Do not fear my servant Jacob, do not worry Israel.' Jacob is juxtaposed with his descendants, Israel. And therefore, just as his descendants are alive, bechayim, so too he is alive, bechayim." If you've seen the movie Coco, that might resonate. But the point that I want to make in this context is that the rabbis are explicit here that when they talk about someone dying, the physical aspect of that is only one part of it. So I'll pause for more questions now, though I had prepared, as I think it said somewhere at the beginning, I had prepared lots more slides that I could show you in a few more texts, but that was a lot of it. So
Okay, so we do have some other questions. Someone says, every time we close the Torah, we say, Asher natan lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam natan b'tochenu.
this is on the nose, exactly.
When did this become part of the liturgy? And does it mean eternal life for everyone all the time? Or is it the potential for eternal life? And do we, I love this part, do we in the year 2024 believe it?
There's three questions. So to question one, I have no idea, but it's all over rabbinic literature in late antiquity. I don't know when that blessing itself was formulated, but referring to it all the time as it being right now the life of eternity. Like there's traditions about should I cook dinner or should I study Torah? And they would say, well, you should study Torah because why would you engage in temporal life when you could engage in eternal life? It's like an actual in this world. That was the first question. The middle question is, does it mean this, that, or the other thing? The answer is yes. I think the ambiguity is the ball game. That it means it's in, think about that phrase. So the blessing, I'm not sure if you said it in English. The blessing when we close the Torah. So every time the Torah is publicly read, we say that God has implanted within us eternal life, the life of eternity. And that is a very vague thing to say, but it is something that's planted in, whether it's the seed. The question of do we believe it is, well, I don't believe any literal things, but I do feel things in life, and the feeling of, I need to be whether you want to contextualize it like Durkheim or, theorists of religion and or psychology of religion or sociology of religion. I do think in 2024, it's very clear that many of us, if not all human beings, have the desire to be part of something greater than just themselves. And for some people, that means something outside of the finite world. And for some people, it means something outside of their own needs, or their own person. Religion is that thing that speaks in many ways to a lot of aspects of that, of being outside of just oneself. And it's a way of giving voice to the feeling of being connected with eternity. Something, well, I'm sure people have lots of thoughts about how, after literal death, after our loved ones die, there are ways in which they're present in our life, not in a way that helps when we want to chit chat with them, but that is a part of our lives. And so if you want to, think of it metaphysically, or if you want to think of it psychologically or sociologically, I think it's quite relevant still in 2024.
So I have a question, having, learned from you tonight, last week, and in other, lucky for me, faculty seminars as well. Seems to me that as you said, your critical subjectivity, your your take on this material is to see more of a continuum than a rupture in the rabbi's worldview between this world and the world to come, if you will, or this world and some next world, or the end times, the best world possible world. But it seems to me also that there's you or they metaphorize some of these phrases all the time. So I guess my question to you is, were there voices that saw, I'm thinking of Kohelet, one of my favorite books. The older you get, the more Kohelet becomes like the book of books, because it's the book of an old person. Whether or not Solomon wrote it, that's another story. It's definitely the book of an older person who really thinks, it's over when it's over. It's over when it's over. The rupture is real. Don't kid yourself. Enjoy this world, because when it's over, it's over. So I guess I'm asking you sort of as a scholar, do you see in the rabbinic text that you know and love so well, do you see voices of real rupture, don't have this more optimistic view of immortality through the study of Torah, immortality through your descendants?
When you say rupture, you mean like death is the end and there's nothing more?
Yeah.
Well, there's not a lot of that. No.
Not in the rabbis, right?
Yeah. There's always sort of discussion and debate about it. There's, for instance, there's one, long debate about what can dead people in the graves, to what extent are they aware of what's happening in the world? It's quite a wacky discussion, and it's never really resolved, but it's a live question. So there's no one saying like, come on, they're dead,
Okay, great. So someone else says, at what point did early Christians, and the participant said, turn the vague rabbinic concepts of eternal life as a continuation of life to resurrection, and then this triad of hell, purgatory, and paradise? So it's really a question about, in this stew of the 1st and 2nd century, where you don't really have Christians yet, you have Jews who believe in Jesus. When do we get a more divided Christian view, if you will, of what the world to come might look like? Where do you see that divide then?
So purgatory is medieval, if I'm not mistaken, but the heaven and hell stuff in various forms predates both Judaism and Christianity, and then comes through in all different forms from the beginning. The idea of collective resurrection, so the meeting again motif with a collective resurrection is very popular in early Christianity from the early church writers at the same time as the rabbis were writing. Um, but they also have all of this metaphoric forms of things. I think it's the Gospel of John. Jesus says, like, you are, like, if you believe in something to the effect of, if you believe in me, you have already overcome death. You are resurrected in me, right? This is being said to living people, and that's written in the first century. So the metaphors were alive completely. When in the Middle Ages, lots of things get both very divided, but also very conversational. Meaning there's a lot more ability for, and there's a lot more documentation of Jews and Christians talking to each other, and Muslims and Jews talking to each other. And that informs things, but there's also a lot more, the development of monographs, individually written books. None of the rabbinic books are the voices of one person. That comes in the early Middle Ages, in the rabbinic sense. I mean, there exist books written by individual people, but in rabbinic writing, there's no monovocal expression. And when that starts to become widespread, then I think it's easier to draw lines. But I think things were pretty, at a certain point, it was clear who was either you're a Jew or you're a Christian or you're a Christian Jew or whatever. It was clear in many ways who was who, but there was a lot of fluidity, I think, in communal discussions, probably I'll say this, in the 4th century, in Antioch, which is in Syria, no, Lebanon. I don't know. The borders didn't exist it was in Syria in antiquity, and now it would be Lebanon, whatever. The borders are fake. That can be taken a lot of different ways. Anyway, I study antiquity. There were different borders. Anyway, in Antioch, big bustling city, very multicultural. And in the 4th century, this very famous church father named Chrysostom has all these sermons, like screaming with such venom at the Christians to stop going to synagogue on Shabbat. You're messing things up. Which is to say, Christians were going to synagogues, probably Jews were going to churches, and lots of other pagan things. Anyway, I'm not sure that really spoke to the exact question, but
Okay, so the last question is, and I'm not sure it might not be as clear, but that's all right. What is the timing of the New Testament's book of Revelation relative to the era of the rabbis? So it's, the rabbinic era is 2nd century to 6th, so I'm not 100% sure.
Revelation is something around the end of the 1st century. And
so the book of Revelations.
Yes.
Okay, 1st century.
The entirety of the New Testament is written before rabbinic activity starts. But then there's all of these early church writings, which are leaders of the church. They're called fathers of the church, or patristic writers, or early Christian writers. There's all different terms. So people like Origen and Tertullian and Chrysostom and Augustine or Augustine later on. They're writing contemporaneous with the rabbi. So they're interpreting the New Testament, they're interpreting the Hebrew Bible, and they're talking about the life of Jews and Christians in their day.
So to what degree then are these rabbinic writings that you have adduced for your understanding of the eschaton part of a rabbinic way of differentiating itself from these early church writings, the 1st century writings?
It's a big question. I think there are elements of a polemic and differentiation and saying, like, we don't think that's dumb. It's never clear whether it was purposeful or not. So one big concept is that and because of the time, I'm not going to elaborate on it, but there was a very important still is a very important Christian doctrine from very early on, known as the doctrine of perfection, that the goal of the best of all possible worlds, everything was perfect. Everything would be perfect. You could be perfect in Christ. And the first half of my book, part 1, is subtitled Imperfect Eschatology. Now, did they know that the Christians were walking around dreaming of perfection? And they said, we can do you one better. Imperfection is the ideal. Or is that just sort of inherently where you go, coming from their style of thinking about the world versus the style of thinking about, Jesus as the physical perfection of God. I don't know. I don't know. That's where imagination comes in.
Well, that's a great way to end tonight. So thank you so much, Professor Labend, for this introduction, really, to such complicated topics like resurrection. I think anyone who knows the liturgy is probably not going to be able to say the words Techiyat Hametim in the same way ever again, or at least will, cogitate a little bit. That's not so fixed, just because it's in the Siddur, the prayer book, it's not so fixed. And to everyone, I want to remind you that we have our last session next week, same time, 7:00, with Dr. Labend. And sorry, I'm getting my screen here is a little, that's why I have two screens. And the topic for next week is the inauguration of the end of time. And I want to just, of the end times, plural. And I also want to remind everyone that next week will be the last public facing program for this semester. And we'll have to say goodbye to Professor Labend as her in her category as visiting scholar. She'll be back for some of us for Rabbinics Conference in March, but really she has to return to do the thing we all get paid for, which is to teach her students at St. Francis College. I want to tell everyone that at the Bildner Center in January, we have an absolutely marvelous event. We are collaborating with the MacArthur Theater in Princeton. They will be showing a special performance of Here There Are Blueberries, an extraordinary play based on an album of photographs that arrived anonymously on the desk of a really brilliant archivist at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, who was able then to figure out where the album came from. And it came from community of German Nazis who lived right outside those horrifying gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And Rebecca Erbelding is the name of the scholar, and she, I believe, is coming to the event. The Bildner Center is cooperating. You need to buy the tickets, but we're going to have a reception. It'll be a speaker. It's 2:00 at the MacArthur Theater in Princeton. You can go on the website and get more details, and I hope I'll see many of you there. And otherwise, have a good evening. Stay warm if it's chilly, and see you next week. I'm looking very forward to learning again from Dr. Labend. So thank you so much and good evening.